Welcome to the August 2024 speaker series of the Friends of Candelaria Nature Preserve. I'm Katie Stone. Today, our guest is very special. His name is Jon Ghahate. He is from the Pueblos of Laguna and Zuni, and he is of the Turkey and Badger clans. Jon is an educator at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado. He was formerly the museum cultural educator at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's a parent and a leader in our community for cultural education, and we're delighted to have him here to speak about the ancestral agricultural lands that we live on and where the Candelaria Nature Preserve is located. Welcome to our speaker series, Jon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. Really, thank you for the kind words. And most importantly, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor and certainly a responsibility that I see as certainly as an educator, but certainly as a member of two of the pueblos that we have here in New Mexico. Before I begin, it's important for us to at least understand a couple of things. Number one, from what Katie said, I've been very fortunate to be involved with a lot of opportunities, but nevertheless, I have to be mindful that the only reason I get to do those things is simply because of those who helped me get there, my educators, certainly my relatives, and those who have preceded us. So as a disclaimer and certainly a full disclosure, I let people know that even though I talk about New Mexico history, I'm not a historian. I certainly teach algebra, physics, and chemistry, but I'm not a physicist nor a mathematician. But I guess the most important thing that I am is I'm a lifelong learner, much like most of you are. So I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for this opportunity to learn a little bit about who the people were that we have the opportunity to share with the culture, with the cuisine, and everything that identifies them as human societies that have always called this place home. So let me begin by opening up my PowerPoint here, and I'm going to share that with you. Do you see that? I don't recall. Can you see that, Katie? Let me go back.
Not yet. Let me get rid of the pin on you and see if that helps. Let me get rid of all these things I've done because I've been trying to bring you to the forefront. Remove the pin. That will help us. There we go.
Can you see the screen now?
No, we still cannot see the screen.
Let me bring that up here.
Let's see. Everyone, though.
Let me share screen. Where's my share screen there? Let's see. Why are we not showing share screen? Oh, there we go. And share my screen and go to the slideshow. There we go. Can you see that now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Well, the reason why I chose this image is those of us who are have that connection to the Pueblo cultures, these mountains, the land, the river, is really the essence of what we call that sense of place. Many groups of human beings, many civilizations, they have been forced to either leave or migrate from their homelands. And as a result of that, many different cultures still try to hang on to that. What prevents or minimizes that or interferes with that as having that sense of place is that connection to land. So those of us who are Pueblo, when we look at the mountains and the river and the Rio Grande, the Sandias, although they're not those names that we have always called them, nevertheless, it's still our home. It's still that place that helps us identify who we are as human beings. And to understand really who the people were that existed long before the other side of the world came to this side of the world, it's helpful to really have that basic understanding of what was here before. The challenges then that interfered or impacted them as a society, as a people of culture, as a group of human beings with a specific language and those core values that held them together as a civilization. And then the desire and certainly the fortitude and resilience to work toward to sustaining that. That's what we see as it applies to those groups that we now refer to as Pueblo. And although we do certainly have our neighbors throughout the surrounding area, our Diné neighbors, Apaches, Comanches, Utes, Paiutes, Tarahumara, Yaqui, Chichimecas, and many, many other groups. They've always called this place home. We are fortunate in that there was something that perhaps when the Spanish came to this side of the world, they embraced some component of that. And to understand that, that's the core principle of why we have these Pueblo communities still very resilient, especially in the state of New Mexico. And so to begin, I want to at least explain to you why these societies, what they had, what their predecessors, their ancestors had established, why they were able to sustain and maintain those civilizations in spite of oppression and forced servitude, slavery, and all the components of what we call colonization. All of these things were elemental to what those societies had, but it just didn't pop up all of a sudden in one day. These were learned skills, these were learned principles of what it meant to be a human society. And we rely on science to a degree, at the same time rely on the oral narrative and oral traditions to help us understand what was really here. And so these are the things that allowed human beings to live on any side of this planet, that at some point people were only hunting and gathering. But if you I've always thought about that. I mean, especially if you're a poor hunter, if you suck at hunting, you really can't survive because you just can't really hunt enough to feed your family. Or like if it was me long back ago, I have to wear glasses, so I'd be a terrible hunter. So I'd probably be one of those that kind of fell by the wayside. So when I think about that hunter-gatherer term, it would be more like I can get more food from gathering than I can actually get from hunting. So that's why I put it that way in a sense, because, and actually there are some scientists and some theoretical anthropologists and archaeologists who are beginning to think that way, because at some point they overhunted and they, if you kill an animal, you eat that day. But if you're a farmer and you progress to an agrarian society, that takes more problem solving skills. And so we're going to talk about that. So these are the things that allow many human beings to live wherever they choose to live. Do you just survive, or do you develop principles to become subsistence, to plan ahead, to use all those problem solving skills you have? So it's important for us to consider to transition from a hunter-gatherer mentality to an agrarian society. It takes a lot more human brain power, a lot more cooperation, a lot more autonomy, a lot more of the things that allow a society to become more sophisticated. And so I'm kind of going to present that as an idea, because these are some of the things that, like I said, theoretical archaeologists and anthropologists are even discussing when you talk about, when you consider going to these large conferences, they're debating this, because if we think about or consider that at some point, if you hunt all the animals, well, then you got to go somewhere else. That forces you to migrate or move your location, so that you don't become a stable society. And so those are some of the things we're going to talk about. But most importantly, what ties all of these things together is, especially as a science teacher, I look at the principles of science. So if you're going to be a farmer, well, you use the principles of biology. If you're going to be a hunter, obviously you might develop a spear or a bow and arrow. Well, those are principles of physics, kinetic and potential energy. And so all of those things connected together when we think about human populations throughout this, what we call the planet Earth, we should consider how science is elemental into how human beings have lived. One of the things I've learned as an educator is that it's helpful to understand the terms when we talk about specific items or specific subjects. I learned this very well because, first of all, I really enjoy teaching algebra. And if my students don't understand concepts like exponent or properties or equation compared to a variable, then they really can't understand or comprehend some of the ideas that I'm trying to help them understand. So I found that vocabulary is essential so communication can be more enhanced. And these are the terms I really focus on as it applies to those groups of human beings that at some point transitioned from simply hunting and gathering to now to become an agrarian society, using problem solving, using one important tool. Obviously, there were tools here in this side of the world before the other side of the world came to this side of the world. And the interesting thing about that is that there were only bone tools, stone tools, and wood tools. Now, there was some areas where there was copper, but there, we don't know, or science has not yet found evidence that there was extensive mining. There were areas where copper was found on superficially. They didn't even have to dig. It was like laying right on the ground. So they were able to get copper in that way. But there's no evidence that there was a transition to smelting it, nor combining it with the other forms, such as getting tin and copper together. Now you have brass. So copper being a very malleable metal, it was very focal or very regional, as well as it was not widely spread out. So for the vast majority of civilizations throughout the Western Hemisphere, everybody pretty much had the same tools: bone tools, wood tools, and stone tools. No one had metal yet. Now, obviously, there was copper, gold, and silver on this side of the world. But again, like I said, those are soft, malleable metals. You really can't use them for or long term for weapons or tools. And so it's important to consider that. And you'll notice the three words that I crossed out at the bottom. And simply because one of the more prominent Pueblo anthropologists, Dr. Edward Dozer from the Pueblo, Santa Clara, who got his PhD in anthropology from the UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, began to consider what he was taught when he was growing up with the Pueblo, Santa Clara, is that when we use specific terms, many times they're very derogatory and very diminutive. They simply imply that, well, you really don't have that skill set yet. And so when the other side of the world came to this side of the world, they would simply imply they're primitive, they're ancient, they really don't have this knowledge yet. So Dr. Dozer began to work with his colleagues saying, we really should stop using terms like primitive or ancient or undeveloped. And at the same time, certainly there were some groups of populations and civilizations that were nomadic to a degree, but it's important to consider that most groups were more migratory, and especially seasonally migratory. Maybe they lived up in the mountains during the summertime because it was easier to find animals to kill. Maybe the weather was more comfortable, more rain. There was wood and tools to be found up there, but then it gets too cold, it starts to snow. Well, then you go down to another place in the valley or the lower part, and you have another home there. And then when the weather changes or the seasons change, then you go back up to the first home you had. So you're seasonally migratory to these two concepts. So the people are using these two principles, and we still use that principle today, but we don't have a term for migratory. We use the term a snowbirder. So if you live up in Wausau, Wisconsin in the summertime because it's cool, you get to fish, you get to canoe, but then it gets really cold in December and ice gets 2 feet thick. Well, you don't like that. So you go down to your second home in West Palm Beach, but you're not moving around. You're not going from Motel 6 to Motel 6. You simply have a summer home and a winter home, and summer home and a winter home. And that takes problem solving. That takes planning, and that takes some organization. So science helps us understand that there were groups of people like that, but there was still some that was still somewhat nomadic to a degree, following bison herds or other groups of animals. But for the vast majority of civilizations that were progressing and moving into that agrarian society, they were more stable, they were more migratory, and they were planning ahead. And lastly, the term that I crossed out there is Anasazi. Currently, the scientific community has chosen not to use that term simply because it's really not reflective of those groups that preceded the Puebloan groups of people. It simply is actually it's not a bad word per se. It's just a very complicated term that even some people aren't quite sure as to its actual true meaning. Some people say it's the old enemy, the old warriors, or the bad enemy, or the bad enemies. So nobody really completely can agree on its actual meaning. The reason why we no longer use that term is simply because the Pueblo, over the past 40 years has worked with the scientific community to say, that's really not who our predecessors were. Our ancestors were very mindful, autonomous, sophisticated societies. And it simply implies that these are kind of maybe have bad ill with them in a sense. So that's why currently the word Anasazi is no longer part of the education of anthropologists and archaeologists. The term that scientists use now is ancestral Puebloan. So it's helpful for me to explain a little bit why the terms that we use. Speaking of terms, it's also mindful to help us understand that what science has had to modify and learn itself as well. So we don't use the terms BC or AD anymore. It's simply because those were oftentimes before any kind of enlightenment or any kind of really consideration and inclusion. People always associate it before, most people say it was before Christ and after Christ, or Anas Dios, which was related to the Christian faith. Well, there are a lot of scientists who are not Christians. Maybe they're Muslims or Hindus, but they're scientists nevertheless. So the current scientific vocabulary that is used to define a specific point in time is BCE, which stands before the Common Era, and CE stands for the Common Era. And that's about the break point is 2,000 years ago. And again, it's probably the time where most people say that's when Jesus was born. But that any time before that point in time, we utilize the term BCE. And so that way we say if corn was grown 9,000 years ago, from that point in time, then today in the year 2024, corn was grown 11,000 years ago. And so that's how scientists currently use this term. So it's helpful to be mindful of those kinds of things. As we're talking about the agrarian society, especially along the Rio Grande, obviously most people are well versed with this particular term. However, this is a Spanish term. It actually has its roots in Arabic, but it's a term that most of us, especially those of us here in Mexico, are well accustomed to. But the idea of ditches and irrigation canals is preceded the coming of the groups of people from the other side of the world at least by 1,000 years. We have different civilizations, different communities who had incorporated the technique of diverting water so that they can sustain and maintain their communities. Today, we would call that hydrology. Long ago, if you were simply demeaning them and simply saying, well, they were just kind of guessing at this, well, we would say, well, they have a ditch or they have a canal system. But scientifically, we would use the word they were hydrologists because they were using the power of their learning skills to use the power of water. And we use that's what a hydrologist does today. So it's mindful to consider that science principles were very important to the establishment and the sustaining of many of these different civilizations throughout the Western Hemisphere. It's important also to consider that we as human beings need three important things for us to exist. With any interruption or any takeaway from any of these three things, we as a society cannot live. We need food and water, we need others to help us out, and we certainly need shelter. No matter where you go on this planet, that's what we need. What has helped the peoples who have lived throughout the Southwest to have sustained and maintained themselves is corn. Without corn on this side of the world, many civilizations would not have existed. And it's important to consider that if we think about that same construct in the Eastern Hemisphere, the two components of commodity that allowed all those civilizations that existed in the Western Hemisphere, in the Eastern Hemisphere was wheat and rice. Without wheat and rice, you would not have had all those civilizations develop and expand. But on the Western side, it was predominantly corn. In the Southern and South America, it was also potatoes. Potatoes originate from South America. But throughout the Western Hemisphere, corn becomes a very important commodity, mostly for sustenance, for sustaining the community, then eventually becomes a trade item. And so corn has always been very elemental. Even today, corn is so important to us. The best way to consider that is, when was the last time you went to a movie? What did you have to have? Popcorn. Well, you could not have popcorn without what indigenous peoples did, and it was through hybridization. And next time you go to the grocery store, pick up any food item that's on the shelf, turn it around and look in the back. You're going to see something related to corn, corn syrup, cornstarch, something related to corn. Corn still is very elemental today. And we've even put it in our gasoline. We put ethanol in there. So corn has always been so integral to why human beings have been able to exist on this side of the world. But and it has contributed to those three things that has allowed human societies to exist and live on this side of the world. What we know is important to help us understand a little bit about how human beings resided in this part of the world, that through the implementation of science principles, through the implementation of problem-solving skills, and mostly through the implementation of science principles, that you would not have all the diverse civilizations that existed throughout the Western Hemisphere. So by the time 1492 comes around, all of these groups of people were living on this side of the world. There was many different languages, there were many different cultures, different belief systems. They had incorporated, depending upon the environment in which they lived. Some of them were living in thatched huts. Some of them were living in large multiple storage structures. Some of them were living still in caves, but they were finding ways to adapt to the environment. And that's what human beings have and continue to do. Obviously, we're having to deal with climate change. So we need to adapt as well. So not only are we thinking of history of the people who adapted, then we will continue to adapt now. And especially if we're thinking to going like to Mars or the moon, well, we have to adapt to that environment as well. So we will always continue to do that as a human society. It's important to consider, like I mentioned, corn begins to be grown at least 9,000 years ago. And it grows from a wild plant that we now call teosinte. That corn now is what we eat today, whether it's a small little kernel of corn that's about this big, which when you go down to, if anybody's been to Peru, they have little corn cobs that have been those heritage corn that they've been growing for eons. They're little corn like this, but they have big kernels like that. And maybe there's about 10 or 15 kernels on this little tiny cob of corn. But then you go to Iowa and their corn is like this, and there's like 2,000 kernels of corn on that. So it's always much like human beings have been able to adapt. Corn is so adaptable, so that by the time the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, I'm sorry, yeah, 1620, they're growing corn there too. But obviously the climate and the environment is different than what it was here in New Mexico. But we continue to grow corn, and it's important for us to consider those kinds of things. Throughout the Southwest, particularly, science helps us understand the different diverse civilizations that have existed here. And they would not have existed without transitioning to an agrarian society. This is the beginning of what allows then those groups that we now call Pueblo, that eventually at some point between 1150 and 1225, they began to reside in this area. But we can look at the evidence that is found throughout the Southwest, the groups of human beings that have always lived here, that have always called this place home. And obviously, it's not the most hospitable place, obviously, because of the rain frequency, the aridness of the land, the moisture, as well as the nutritional content of the ground. It takes more time and effort to become a farmer, as well as to provide enough food for the community. But we can see the evidence throughout the Southwest. And as Katie mentioned about Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, it's a very well-respected international institute that looks at all the evidence that we see in this region, and it begins to try to help us understand. Simply, all of these ideas are certainly theoretical hypotheses, but with the more information, the more evidence we collect, we can be fairly sure about the hypotheses that we create, but we see evidence of what has changed. It's important also to consider that 2 years ago, something changed here as our understanding of how long human beings have been on the western side of this planet. And simply because of those footprints that were found at White Sands National Monument, which were then evaluated because prior to that, most people were thinking, well, maybe human beings have been here 10,000 years. Maybe we'll kind of fudge it a little. What kind of, and it actually is up until like 1930, 1940, most people were thinking, well, 5,000 years was really the extent of what evidence that was available to them at the time. But since those findings of those footprints at White Sands, now we're thinking about 23 to 25,000 years ago. That's how long human beings have been here. And we know that simply because alongside those human footprints, we have mastodon and mammoth and giant sloth footprints. Well, science knows when those species were no longer on this planet. Currently, the scientific understanding from evidence that is being created helps us understand specific changes in the development of humankind throughout the Western Hemisphere, specifically of the Western Hemisphere, and more specifically of the Southwest, that they've given these specific time dates as it applies to human populations in this particular region. What's most important to consider is that we see a gradual progression of problem-solving skills, how people live, how long they lived in a specific region, the kinds of tools and items that created to sustain and maintain their civilization, and then continually progressing with the kinds of structures, and then to the extent that you have large structures like Chaco and Mesa Verde, and then extended outlier groups. We see that throughout the Southwest, and this is how scientists will look at the data, the evidence that applies to these communities, and that's why they can begin to differentiate. Says, well, that region over there kind of looks a slightly different, but as compared to this side, we can see this difference of either how the tools were made, perhaps we can date the tools and other things, and that's why currently science has designated these different time periods in which we can understand that. As I mentioned before, some people are really considering kind of not saying hunter-gatherer, but gatherer-hunter, because like I said, it takes, if you're not a good hunter, you probably won't eat that day. Or if you make too much noise, or you're talking too loud, you're scaring all the animals away. And then if all the animals you hunt them to extinction, well, then you got to go and move away. So these are the components of what it means to be that transition from a hunter-gatherer to now an agrarian society. The tools that were incorporated, like I said, were bone tools, stone tool, and wood tools. But the one tool that we oftentimes fail to really attribute or give its full value to is really that tool that's between our ears, called our brain. Because without the human brain, we could not solve problems. We could not begin to identify problems and then try problems. Thomas Edison said, if I've tried 99 times to solve a problem and they've all failed, I know that I don't need to do those same thing 99 times. So that's what problem solving is. You begin to address an issue and then you look toward ways to, what did I do last time that didn't work out? So these were the things that most anthropologists and archaeologists look at in trying to help us understand was what those human beings who were living in this region were coming up against. A drought, maybe crop failure, maybe other groups of people picking on them and stealing their crops. Maybe there was a disease in their community. Maybe there was some internal strife. Whatever it was that impacted the ability to continue to progress as an agrarian society, these are essential to what allowed any society to exist. As I mentioned before, when we think about the word acequia, most people are usually attributed to our northern New Mexico neighbors, their predecessors, their ancestors, those who came during the colonization by the Spanish who came to this area. But if anybody's ever flown to Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, you see the remnants of two large societies. One's called Pueblo Grande, and those structures are about 6 blocks north of Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, and the other one is called Casa Grande, which is in between Phoenix and Tucson. So they were using these large canals that were able to sustain and maintain a society by growing the crops, growing the food, and sustaining that community as an existence for those groups of people who were living here. And this is an extension of that idea of the way which science helps us understand that progression. as human beings are beginning to improve in their skill set and learned knowledge, so that now my community is now not just from a couple of families. We're talking anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 groups of people living in large societies. And the best example of these two particular communities are Chaco and Mesa Verde. Even though we see these 14 large structures at Chaco and the multitude of cliff dwelling sites at Mesa Verde, it shows that there were a lot of people living there. And some people estimate anywhere from 50,000 plus on groups of people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. That's a lot of people to sustain a society. And most importantly, that requires a certain degree of governance. That is a collective society. We all agree to either work together or we're not going to work together. Or we all agree to build these structures because Bob can't do that all by himself. I need Mary and Jeff and John and all these other groups of people. And that's what leadership requires, that you engage with those and then you can transmit your knowledge of what you have here or your vision so that you can communicate with others. And it's important for us to consider those kinds of things. The last two are the post-colonial components of Pueblo 4 and Pueblo 5. And if you're interested, Katie, I can give another presentation on the significant societal, cultural, existential, and connected changes that occurred after 1400, because now you're having a whole new group of people come, and this leads up to things like very prevalent today. I'm just reading you all from Taos on a land grant section, and in Albuquerque you have the Elena Gallegos land grant. Placitas is a land grant. All of these things exist simply because of what occurred in the Pueblo 4 and Pueblo 5, but that's another thing we can talk about, Katie, sometime in the future.
That's the
it's important. Yeah, yeah. So it's important for us to consider that for human beings to exist, especially as a society expands, I look at it as a scientist as what we call a feedback system. That system has to progress in a certain direction. So if we have a community, a large group of people, well, I need to feed them. Everybody needs to be fed. If there's this problem with feeding all the people, obviously people are going to start creating issues for one another. You're going to start stealing from one another, or maybe hoarding your food. And so if we can see that today in some of the places that are under famine or under warfare, the kinds of things that you're going to try to benefit yourself simply because I don't have enough food. So when I think about a community and food production, I think of it as a positive feedback system. So if I have a large community, I need a certain amount of food. And then certainly if I have enough food, then I can expand my community. As long as this cycle, this positive feedback cycle continues in one direction, I'll continue to expand. I have more people to work on, so I can engage with a leadership component so that I can have more people working out in the field. But not everybody has to work out in the field. Maybe somebody needs to make clothing. Someone needs to make baskets. Someone needs to make pottery. Someone needs to take care of the children. Someone needs to help build on an extension off to another part of your building. So this component, this feedback cycle is essential for that continued progression to an agrarian society. We see the evidence of corn and its influence to many societies throughout the Southwest. And it's without corn, like I said, we would not have the evidence of what we see. And you notice I've said evidence. I have not said the word ruins. And the reason why I don't use the word ruins, because for those of us who are Pueblo and those of us who are Native American, they're not ruins to us. What they are is evidence of what our predecessors did, those problem-solving skills. So that's another term that I have sort of eliminated from my vocabulary, but I do use it periodically to simply imply something. But to us, they're not ruins because they're evidence of what human beings have done, and the core principles that is very much a part of our Pueblo communities even today. The thing about that migration from Chaco and Mesa Verde to what we now call the Rio Grande corridor, so that you see, if you're driving from Albuquerque up to Santa Fe, and as you look to the left, just past Sandia, you see those fields there. And if you drive at other places throughout the Southwest, especially along the Rio Grande corridor, that 200-mile long corridor from Taos all the way down to Socorro, which used to be a Pueblo. All of these things were elemental to why those groups of people were able to sustain and maintain their communities. And again, science helps us understand that those groups of people who had resided in Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and other what we call outliers of that region at some point between 1150 and 1225 decided it was time to move. And most of the time, scientists will theorize and say, well, maybe it was drought, maybe it was crop failure, maybe it was incursion by other groups. Those are certainly elemental to what we could say, but we also consider other things like, that there was the spiritual members within the community that says, I've got a sign that tells us we need to move. It's time for us to go on to our next home where we need to establish ourselves. Or maybe somebody say, well, I don't like living next to my mother-in-law, so I'm going to go over there. So we don't know what it was really that caused groups of people decide to leave what we now call the Four Corners region, then migrate into what we now call the Rio Grande corridor. So by the time the Spanish eventually arrived here 350 years later, they found all of these communities there. And it's important to consider, I said 350 years later. That means they have those groups of people who we now refer to as Pueblos. They had been living there 350 years. That means they were living 100 years longer than the United States was the United States, and we are still here. So it's important to consider that as evidence of resilience and perseverance in spite of all the things that have always impacted us. As I mentioned before, at Pueblo Grande and Casa Grande, we see how people were utilizing the power of water. They were utilizing the problem-solving skills. Obviously, you're talking about gravity. You're finding ways to improve the water flow, the management of water, we call hydrology. All of these things were elemental to what these groups of people were doing and how they were able to sustain and maintain a society. These were learned skills, and they were able to continue those learned skills. So by the time those groups that we now refer to as Pueblo, they're residing and using those same skill sets that allowed them to exist from Taos all the way down to Socorro. And most people are certainly knowledgeable of the fact that we have these current 19 Pueblos, but it's estimated from some of the earliest Spanish documents that there were probably anywhere from 60 to 80 distinct communities along these, what we now call the Rio Grande corridor, simply because of what people found when they came here. Not just these current 19 ones, but there were many, many more that existed throughout the entire region. This just shows you all the things that were on this side of the world that were grown by different groups of people. And the important thing to consider here, none of these things are grown in the wild. They all are commodities. They all have to be grown by human beings. They all have to be planted. They have to be cultivated. They have to be watered, and they have to be harvested. They just don't do that by themselves. They've been hybridized to the point that they no longer are wild plants anymore. Now, certainly we get some wild plants. The only one is wild rice up in Wisconsin and Minnesota. We don't need to physically plant it. It just grows by itself. But all the other ones, we have to plant it and harvest it, and then we have to plant it again. It's not a perennial. All of those things are elemental, and all of these came through hybridization. You find the best ones that give you the best crop. And again, those are what human beings have always done and continue to do, because we have some of our farmers who use many of these, what we call heritage seeds to continue being the farmer that they are. Certainly science helps us understand why we have crops and grows. Certainly, like if I plant a seed, I grow, but unless we really know the actual formula, what is it that makes things grow? Obviously, I could show you this. This is a formula for photosynthesis, but people didn't know that stuff 2,000 years ago. But they were enough of knowledge for them to sustain and maintain their cultures. But now we know this is really what allows us to grow corn, beans, squash, chili, all of the things that were essential. But they were using this principle. They just not had understood it. And people always have adapted to their many forms of how they were growing crops and items, whether it's next to a river or next to waffle gardens. These kinds of things were very elemental to how human beings were able to sustain and maintain a culture. This is a picture from during the late 1800s of Zuni, Pueblo, and that's where you're going to go tomorrow, right? You said, Katie, that you'll be going to Zuni. This is the backside. This is looking north from the south side of the Zuni River. Well, the river is kind of much dried up now, but this is one of the oldest pictures that we have of Zuni, Pueblo.
I love
And
those
so when,
gardens. Sorry.
yeah, and so no, not at all. And so as we kind of draw to a close, to consider what the Pueblo communities had as agrarian societies. These societies did not all of a sudden just poof come up with this knowledge. It came from their predecessors. Those groups of human beings that had resided at Chaco and Mesa Verde, and then long before them, at least 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, those groups of people who then hybridized corn. So for us as a society in the year 2024, when we eat and enjoy anything related to what we call Southwest cuisine, is simply because of what people learned from their predecessors and how you then transmit all that knowledge to the next generation. That's what language is helpful. But with these three things, corn, beans, and squash, what holds them together is the science of biology, the science of being a human being, the science of terminology and vocabulary, because these are learned skills. This is what is essential to transition from simply hunting and going and killing an animal. Because if you kill an animal, like I mentioned before, well, you get to eat that day. You get to cook it up and eat that day. But if you're a farmer, you plant it, it's not going to come up the next day. You have to plan ahead. You have to water it. You have to harvest it. And then what do you do in the interim? Well, do you just sit around and wait? Do you kind of go binge watch on Netflix? No, you got to do stuff. You got to build stuff. You got to prepare for what if your crop doesn't going to provide enough food for everyone? Well, you got to prepare. How do you preserve food? How do you plan ahead? These are for scientists to look at that transition to becoming an agrarian society. It's not just growing stuff. It's also progressing in skill sets and learned capabilities. This is what is helpful to understand when we consider these kinds of things. So again, this is a picture of Phoenix. Those canals that were dug 1,000 years ago are still being utilized. Just like we see places like Chaco and Mesa Verde, we still see the evidence of what human beings were doing at that time. This is one of the earliest images or recorded maps of what the Spanish found in the early 1800s. As you can see, there was more than just 19 pueblos. Certainly there are some. If you go east on I-40 to Tijeras and go down New Mexico State Road 337 toward Mount Air, you come to Chilili, Tehique, and other places. And if you go north on North 14 up to Santa Fe, you come to Galisteo, La Cienega, La Señora. Those were pueblos as well. If you go from Espanola up to Ghost Ranch, there were pueblos along there. So there were many, many more pueblos, not just these current 19. But obviously, as I mentioned to Katie, after the colonial period, something has changed. And so that's another topic that if you're interested, I can definitely present to you on that. So these are current 19 pueblos. And if you've ever been to our pueblos for feast days, we're glad that you experienced our culture. And if you had the opportunity to go to our, someone say, oh, come on, sit down at our table, have some food to eat. That's our culture, because we know that what our predecessors went through, how to transition from a hunter-gatherer society and the essential principles of what it took to become an agrarian society. It took perseverance, resilience, and again, most importantly, is problem solving to again develop that skill set that's still very prevalent And even though certainly many of our Pueblo members, they still have their fields of corn and crops, beans and squash and so forth, but they also have gone to school. Now, as a native people, we are academics, we are educators, we're healthcare practitioners, we're attorneys, we're public servants, we're active duty personnel, we're veterans. We have a Native American who's flown up in the International Space Station. We have a Native American who's actually training with NASA in their potential trip to the moon. We have a Native American who's the Secretary of Interior. So certainly an agrarian society encompasses more. It's not just planting, but it's really problem solving and expanding that knowledge and then transferring that knowledge to the next generation. And so I want to thank you all for listening to my presentation. I hope I've kind of provided you a little bit of insight into what allows a human society to transition from a hunting-gatherer society to, it's not just growing stuff. It's really being a human being, using all the tools that we have at our disposal, and then continuing to progress with that. I do want to mention this one particular book. I've learned a lot from this particular book. This is a fantastic book. It actually talks about agrarian societies on both sides of the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. I used this as one of the books I had at the Indian Public Cultural Center, a book club. It's a little complicated. It's a real academic book, but if you want to read this book, it's fantastic. And it talks, again, how that transition from being a hunter society and just simply gathering stuff to now an agrarian society, all the things that encompass it, an autonomous, sophisticated, problem-solving society. Those are the things that this particular book talks about. And if you ever get a chance to read it, I would love to hear what you think about it. But thank you, everybody. And I'll be glad to answer any questions if anybody has a question to ask.
Jon, that was so cool. Thank you so much for that whole presentation. And I always love how you remind us that these things we think of as our technologies. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the whole Zoom thing. Our technologies, they're not ours. They were here. My guess is we're going to find, when they keep digging, canals that go back 35,000 years. I mean, come on, people are smart. They knew they had to direct the water. They understood that there was, I don't know. This is my vision. Anyway, I love I love I have a question for you right away. So the practice of farming, we don't need to get into the complicated nature of, who is here first and all that good stuff, but we know, since you're Zuni, we'll talk Zuni. The Zuni people had a very wide area, in some maps I look at of, long, long ago, thousands of years ago. The Zuni people, I assume, would have come to the Rio Grande Valley. Was there farming done that long ago before the ancestral Puebloan, you know what I'm saying? The migration of folks coming in speaking other languages?
Yeah, certainly. We see corn, the artifacts of corn that are coming from the Pueblo II period. Sorry, the basket maker II period. The archaic group of people are those groups of people that science has identified that still lived, for the most part, in what we call pit houses. You dig a hole, you cover it up with something. And we still see evidence of that up until about the year 700, that people were beginning to live in groups of family groups together. A pit house might house a family unit. We don't know specifically what a family unit was, but we estimate it's probably anywhere from 4 to 6 people. But as what science helps us understand is they become more sophisticated in growing larger crops, having more food to feed people. Now you have someone's thinking, well, I got my family, got my spouse, I got my kids. Now, grandma wants to come and live with us. My mother-in-law wants to come and live with us. Well, we need a bigger place to live. And so we think about the scientists think about that. Well, what's causing them to then decide, well, it takes too much effort to dig a hole in the ground and just cover it up. Then we transition to what we call block houses, much like you would see at Santa Ana or Santo Domingo or Kiwa, that you see long groups of houses connected to one another, like big condos or big apartment complexes. But then at some point around the year 900, now we start seeing things like Chaco and Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly, where you see multiple story structures. They're not just expanding out, they're expanding upward. But to build a multiple story structure, well, you're using architectural physics, because maybe scientists will think, well, maybe the first time they built something, it came tumbling down. So somebody's thinking, well, what didn't I do that's going to support all this stuff that I can support it? We still see it when we go to Chaco. So again, what prompts a group of human beings that I don't like living in a hole anymore because maybe it's stinky, or too many bugs or spiders, it's dusty, but now I want to live on the top of the ground. So I progress to these multiple story structures that we still get to see at Chaco. So again, thinking about what prompts a society to do that is, again, and then to stay in the same spot, that takes perseverance and planning, that you consider that. And if you're gonna, those groups of people that lived in pit houses, maybe they used the resources in their community, right in that region. They used up all the wood, they hunted all the animals, they picked all the food that they was able to eat. Well, then you got to go find another spot. But if you're going to stay in a spot for 300 plus years, that means you're growing crops, or maybe then you're importing them too. Commerce comes in. So those are the things that scientists think about when we evaluate the evidence that we see at these multiple story structured sites, such as Chaco, Mesa Verde, and so forth. Does that help?
Yeah, and when you were showing that map of those 60 some or whatever pueblos dotting the middle Rio Grande Valley, I think about where we are and our place here. And I know we're pretty far south of you right now here in Albuquerque, but we're right here. And I'm thinking about the myths that we've heard about our ditch right here, like and the truth about our ditch right here. Our ditch right here that feeds the Candelaria Nature Preserve is the oldest ditch in Albuquerque, and I think they date it back to, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, 1706. Okay, so do the math on 1706. I'm thinking Pueblo Revolt, 1680. For those of you who don't know,
20
1706.
years before.
Like we're talking like that's not that long ago. That's like 1998 compared to now.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, right. Well, consider
they
that.
used your ditch, didn't they? Like they stole, they like that is really not like the claim that this is this old, ditch is it. I feel like these ditches we have today, they surely were just the ditches that they took.
You're
This land
appropriated.
was farmed, right? When that,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some people, some historians are looking at the Spanish account, and we have to give the Spanish some degree of credit because they wrote stuff down. And certainly we rely on Pueblo narratives but again, some people aren't always fully accommodating because, stories can always kind of be variable. But we certainly can combine with the Pueblo narratives and combined with what the Spanish wrote, we can kind of get a better understanding. And it's estimated that within what we call the city of Albuquerque, think about the city limits of Albuquerque. It's estimated there were probably 4 pueblos, maybe 5 distinct communities, maybe a mile or 2 separate from one another, but they were in that region. It's not like nobody wasn't there. People were living there. And so they were growing crops and stuff. And then this kind of might lead into another presentation, is that one of the things the Spanish did was as early as 1620, some people say even later, 1640, is that they began to identify and acknowledge the land in which the people were living. And 2 things occurred. Number one, they were building churches because they were Christianizing them. But to do that, you had to accept one important premise before that, you had to accept them as a human being, because you don't build churches for heathens, barbarians, cats, or dogs. You build churches for human beings. Because at the same time, there's something going on the other side of the world, which we call the Spanish Inquisition. So anybody that was not seen worthy of the Catholic faith at that time was simply being persecuted and killed. Anybody who was a Jew, a Muslim, a gypsy, a gay, a lesbian, a heretic, a pagan, a heathen, those people were simply being killed. Okay. And so to come to this side of the world and begin to force people to build churches for themselves, you have to accept them as human beings. And then from the center of town where they would build these churches, they would measure out a specific, it was called the Pueblo League. And a league at the time was 3.2 miles. So it's 6 miles this way and 6 miles this way. Those were called land grants. And you see the evidence of that still here in New Mexico. You drive around, you see the saying that says Baca land grant, Chavez land grant. You come, the largest land grant in Albuquerque is the Elena Gallegos land grant. And if you come up to Taos, the first sign you see, it says you're entering the Cristobal de la Sierra land grant. And if anybody who's a native of New Mexico, remember in the 70s, this big land warfare with tierras, tierrina, yeah, because the land grants, that's what the Spanish acknowledged. And those land grants were saying, yeah, you guys are living here. We know you guys are over there, and we'll measure it out for you. So that was really elemental to not just farming, not just irrigation canals, but really the sense that people were really invested in being an agrarian society. Again, but that's a whole new topic. And I
well, that actually answers a good question, because it explains why the Doranes lateral goes maybe 3 miles from the church, right?
Yeah,
3 miles.
Of course, yeah.
See,
again, that's history. History. There's a real famous saying that it was from a German philosopher. He says the one thing we learn from history is we don't learn from history, because we still repeat the same stupid stuff again and again.
It's true.
But we need to know history. And another famous saying that I use is from a very famous American citizen who was a slave owner, a very prominent individual. He said, the best deterrent against tyranny is a well-educated citizenry. And Thomas Jefferson said that.
I know there's probably other questions from the group, perhaps. If not, I still have another question. I hate to keep going on with my questions, but sorry.
And it's Jeannie. Can I just say, John, we'd love to have you back sometime if you can arrange it with Katie. We love what you have to say, and it's a beautiful level of communication and so clear. And I'm making notes because we're in the middle of developing an interpretive plan for the whole Candelaria Nature Preserve, or pretty far along. And what you're saying is very, very useful.
Okay, go ahead. All right, I'll be there.
So
certainly.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll send Katie a link. Actually, I'm giving another presentation on next Saturday on Don Juan de Oñate that I gave for the New Mexico Historical Society. That's you can it's going to be, I think, either videoed or taped or recorded. So I'll let you know. I'll be up in Saturday. I'll be up in Espanola.
Cool.
Well, we invite you to come visit Candelaria Nature Preserve, John, and anyone in this group, and see for yourself this beautiful land that we're speaking about, that has, and the current stewardship of it, because that's all we can do right now is steward this land and at least it's common land as it maybe was once before. We're trying. And I also I want to ask you just a final question, which I know you speak many languages, and I believe you speak Zuni. Is there a Zuni word for the word acequia?
No, not acequia, but we didn't have very many, what's the word? Ditches.
Yeah.
Mostly the waffle gardens. And the river was right through the community there. So there was not a lot of ditch per se. Later on, there was after 1800, because then we had different places to grow. For Laguna, Laguna did not become a recognized pueblo until 1692. So that we use the word acequia.
Interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting. Well, we do have more to learn from you. So thank you for agreeing to come back to our presentation. Jon
It's my
Ghahate.
honor. Okay, just to let you know, everyone, Katie has my email address. If you have a question that you thought of later on, say, oh, I should have asked that, email it to Katie. She can send it to me, and I'll get back with you. All right?
Sounds
It's an
good.
honor, and an honor, and I'm just glad to speak with you all.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Jon.
It was really great.
Thank you, Jon.
I'm going to conclude by letting you all know that we have a speaker every month. We have a speaker again next month. Don't ask me in this second who that is, because I'm not looking at that list, because I'm so thoroughly engrossed right now in what we were just learning. But thank you so much for being with us. The Friends of Candelaria Nature Preserve is open to everyone, so feel free to come and visit us at our website, friendsofcandelarianaturepreserve.org. These videos are saved on our YouTube page, and there you have notes of the YouTube post for ways to reach out to us and to learn more. And thank you very much for being with us today. And I'm going to stop.